It was a rainy Thursday night when Charlotte Hayes stood in the kitchen, waiting for the kettle to boil. From the living room, she heard Daniel's low voice. At first, she thought he was talking to a friend, but when she heard her name and the words, "Take half of it after the divorce," her world stopped. She froze, her heart racing, realizing her husband was planning to take her business, the company she had built from nothing. She didn't make a sound. She just listened as he laughed and said, "She won't see it coming." For 10 years, Charlotte had believed they were a team. She had built her skincare brand from her small apartment, working nights, testing formulas, and shipping boxes herself. Daniel had stood beside her in the beginning, cheering her on, but once the business grew and money started coming in, his attitude changed. He became distant, demanding, and always talking about their future wealth. She brushed it off, thinking stress was changing him. But that night, when she overheard his plan, she knew this wasn't stress, it was betrayal. The next morning, Charlotte acted normal. She made breakfast, smiled, and kissed him goodbye. Inside, she was shaking. She couldn't let him know what she had heard. She called her closest friend, Lena, the CFO of her company, and told her everything. Lena wasn't surprised. She said Daniel had been asking strange questions about the company's financials for months. Charlotte realized she had to protect herself before it was too late. That week, she met with a lawyer named Mark Ellison. He listened quietly as she explained everything. Then he helped her set up a trust under her company's foundation, a legal, transparent move that protected her ownership. It wasn't revenge, it was survival. Charlotte made sure every step was clean and fair. No lies, no tricks. Just quiet strength. For the next few weeks, she pretended nothing was wrong. Daniel thought he had everything under control. He smiled more, acted sweeter, even talked about planning a vacation. Charlotte played along, holding her calm. Inside, she was counting the days. Then one morning, Daniel served her divorce papers. He looked confident, almost smug, as if he had already won. But when his lawyer reviewed the business documents, confusion crossed his face. Daniel demanded answers, but there were none. The company wasn't his to claim. Every part of it was safely under Charlotte's name, protected by the trust. His plan had collapsed before it even started. Daniel shouted, begged, and accused her of betrayal. But Charlotte stayed silent. She didn't need to argue. She had already won by refusing to be his victim. When the court ruled in her favor, Daniel walked out defeated. Months later, Charlotte launched a new product line called Freedom by Hayes. She didn't tell anyone the full story. She didn't need to. Her peace and strength spoke louder than any revenge ever could. Charlotte watched her husband pack his suitcase, pretending to feel confused. He had finally filed for divorce after months of acting distant. She stayed calm, knowing what he didn't. Everything he had planned to take was already out of his reach. For weeks, she had been preparing for this moment, keeping her voice steady and her actions simple. The house that once felt full of love now echoed with silence and lies. When Daniel left that morning, Charlotte sat alone, staring at the ring on her finger. It used to mean partnership, but now it felt like a chain. She removed it slowly, placed it on the table, and took a deep breath. There was no anger left in her, only clarity. She had seen his greed grow over time, how he stopped caring about her dreams and started treating her success like a prize he deserved. The court hearings began a few weeks later. Daniel walked in wearing his favorite suit, his smile confident. He thought he would walk away with millions. But when his lawyer presented his claims, they fell apart one by one. Every document showed that the company was legally and transparently owned by Charlotte's trust. There was no loophole, no hidden way in. She had followed every rule and protected what was hers. Daniel's expression changed from pride to panic. He whispered to his lawyer, trying to understand how she had managed to stay one step ahead. Charlotte didn't look at him. She just focused on her attorney's calm words. It wasn't about winning, it was about ending the nightmare he had created. When the judge read the final decision, Charlotte finally felt free. After the court ruling, Daniel tried calling her several times. He sent long messages saying he was sorry, that he didn't mean to hurt her, that he wanted to start over. She never replied. Some nights, she thought about the man she once loved and how he had turned into someone she couldn't recognize. But she refused to let the past hold her down. She poured her energy into her company again. The office felt lighter, brighter. Her employees noticed her peace returning. She launched a new campaign, not just to grow her brand but to remind herself that she had survived something dark and come out stronger. The name of her new line, Freedom by Haze, said everything she felt. Months later, Charlotte sat by her office window, watching the sunset reflect off the city skyline. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about knowing she could lose everything and still rebuild it on her own terms. The betrayal had cut deep, but it had also set her free. She smiled softly, knowing Daniel's plan to destroy her had only made her unbreakable. Charlotte could feel the distance growing between them. Daniel had started coming home late, claiming business dinners or meetings she was never told about. He seemed distracted, checking his phone constantly, keeping it face down when she was near. She wanted to believe he was just busy, but deep inside, she felt something had changed. The warmth they once shared had turned cold, replaced by polite conversations and empty smiles. She began to notice small details, his sudden interest in her company's finances, the way he casually asked questions about profits and ownership. At first, she laughed it off, thinking he was just curious. But soon, his tone became more serious, almost cautious. Whenever she tried to talk about it, he brushed her off, saying she was overthinking things. One afternoon, Charlotte's close friend and CFO, Lena Morgan, came to her office with a worried look. She said Daniel had been asking strange questions to one of the accountants about the company's joint assets. Charlotte felt her chest tighten. She wanted to deny it, but everything was starting to make sense: the secrecy, the charm, the sudden kindness that felt forced. That evening, Charlotte sat alone in her office, staring at the numbers on her computer screen. It wasn't just about money, it was about trust. She realized she couldn't sit back and hope things would fix themselves. She had worked too hard, built too much, to let anyone take it away from her, especially the man who was supposed to protect her. She decided to stay quiet and watch. She didn't confront him, didn't show anger. Instead, she started observing his behavior closely. When he made phone calls, she paid attention to the names he mentioned. When he left his laptop open, she noticed he had been reading articles about marital property laws. Each clue felt like another knife in her heart, confirming what she feared the most: Daniel was planning something against her. But Charlotte didn't cry or break down. She took it all in and decided to act smartly. She talked to no one except Lena, who promised to keep everything confidential. Together, they began preparing for what might come, making sure every detail in the company's structure was secure and transparent. Charlotte learned how powerful silence could be. She smiled when she had to, pretended everything was normal, and waited for the right time. She wasn't ready to expose him yet. She wanted to be sure, completely sure, before taking her next step. Every night, she replayed the warning signs in her mind, trying to remember when things had started to fall apart. She didn't know exactly what Daniel was planning, but she knew one thing clearly: whatever game he was playing, she wouldn't let him win. Charlotte sat quietly in her office that night, the city lights glowing through the glass walls. The sound of rain outside mixed with the hum of the air conditioner, but her mind was louder than everything else. She kept hearing Daniel's voice in her head, the way he had asked her to sign a few routine papers a few days ago. She had smiled, taken the documents, and told him she'd read them later, but she never did. Something in his tone had felt wrong, almost rehearsed. Later, when she went through those papers alone, she realized what they really were. Hidden among the harmless-looking clauses was one that could give Daniel control over part of her company. It wasn't an accident, it was a plan. He was waiting for their 10th anniversary, the point where the law could let him claim a bigger share of her assets as marital property. Her heart sank, but her expression never changed. She had learned to hide her emotions well. The next morning, she acted normal. She made breakfast, asked about his day, and even laughed when he joked about their upcoming anniversary. But deep down, she knew it wasn't going to be a celebration, it was going to be war. She started documenting everything, every message, every receipt, every conversation that could later prove his intentions. She wanted to make sure that when the time came, she would be ready and protected. At night, she barely slept. She would stare at the ceiling, thinking about the man sleeping next to her, the same man who once held her hand when she had nothing. How could someone who had promised love and loyalty turn into a stranger filled with greed? The pain was real, but so was her determination. She couldn't let him destroy what she had built with years of hard work and sleepless nights. Charlotte decided she needed help. Not emotional help, legal help. She knew she couldn't just rely on hope or trust anymore. Her mind shifted from heartbreak to strategy. She wasn't going to confront Daniel yet. She wanted him to keep believing she was unaware, that she was still the trusting wife he could manipulate. That was her strength now, patience. Each day that passed, she learned to control her emotions a little more. She smiled when she wanted to scream. She cooked his favorite meals and listened to his stories as if nothing was wrong. But inside, she was preparing her next move. She had already decided that before Daniel could take anything from her, she would take away the chance itself. When she finally looked at herself in the mirror one morning, she didn't see a broken woman. She saw someone who was hurt, yes, but also strong, someone ready to fight quietly and smartly for her own survival. Charlotte sat across from her lawyer, Mark Ellison, in a quiet office filled with papers and calm light. She spoke softly but clearly, explaining how her husband had been planning to take her company through divorce. Mark listened without interrupting, his eyes steady on hers. When she finished, he said, "You've done the right thing by coming here before it's too late." His voice carried the kind of assurance she hadn't felt in weeks. Mark began outlining a legal plan to protect her business. Everything he said was fair and transparent. There was nothing illegal or hidden, only smart strategy. He explained how she could move her company shares into a trust under her foundation, a structure that would still belong to her but remain outside of Daniel's reach. Charlotte felt relief for the first time in days. She didn't want revenge, she just wanted safety. For the next few days, Charlotte worked closely with Mark and her CFO, Lena. Every document was reviewed twice, every signature made with care. They stayed late at the office, making sure every detail was correct. It wasn't about hiding anything, it was about protecting what she had built from the ground up. Her company was her life's work, and she couldn't let someone take it out of greed. When the trust was finally set up, Mark handed her the final document. "It's done," he said. Those two words felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. Charlotte looked at the papers in her hand, feeling a quiet strength. Everything she had worked for was now secure, safe from manipulation. That evening, she went home to Daniel, who was sitting comfortably on the couch, scrolling through his phone. He smiled when she walked in, pretending to be the loving husband he once was. She returned the smile, acting calm and collected. He had no idea that his plan was already useless. Charlotte had learned how to play his game without showing her cards. The following days went by as usual. They had dinner together, laughed over small talk, and even planned their anniversary. Daniel thought everything was perfectly normal. But behind her calm eyes, Charlotte carried knowledge that would soon end his deception. Each time he looked at her and thought she was unaware, she felt a quiet satisfaction. Late one night, when Daniel was asleep, Charlotte stood by the window and looked out at the city lights. She felt a mix of sadness and strength. She had once loved him deeply, but now she understood that love couldn't exist without respect. She whispered to herself, "It's over now." Everything was ready. The company was safe, her plan was complete, and she no longer felt afraid. Whatever Daniel tried next, he would find nothing left to take, not her business, not her peace, not her power. Charlotte continued her days as if nothing had changed. She woke up early, went to the office, attended meetings, and came home to dinner with Daniel. Every move she made was calm and steady. She smiled when he spoke, laughed when he joked, and acted like the same loving wife he had always known. But deep inside, she was counting each day, knowing that soon everything would come to light. Daniel believed he had her fooled. He was confident, relaxed, and even more affectionate than before. He thought his secret plan was perfectly hidden. But Charlotte was already ahead of him. She had made sure the company's shares were safe in the trust, the legal documents were complete, and every financial detail was secure. She didn't need to rush, time was on her side. Her assistant and Lena were the only two people who knew what was going on. They worked quietly behind the scenes, handling everything with care. Lena made sure no information reached Daniel's hands, not even by accident. Whenever Daniel visited the office, the staff treated him politely, unaware of what he was really trying to do. Charlotte had built a wall of silence around her truth. At home, things looked normal. They went out for dinner, talked about their future, and even planned a small trip for their anniversary. Daniel often spoke about how proud he was of her success. His words sounded sweet, but Charlotte could hear the false tone behind them. She no longer felt anger, she only felt distance. It was strange how love could fade without shouting, how betrayal could turn into calm determination. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Daniel mentioned something about their business again. Charlotte nodded, hiding her reaction. She watched him carefully, memorizing his every word, every expression. It was like observing a stranger pretending to be her husband. He truly believed he was in control, but she already held all the power. Sometimes, Charlotte wrote in her journal late at night. She didn't write about pain or betrayal, she wrote about freedom, how it felt to take back control of her life without losing her dignity. She didn't want revenge that would destroy him. She wanted peace that would protect her. As the days passed, Daniel's behavior grew even more confident. He started dropping hints about big changes coming soon, smiling as if he was close to victory. Charlotte listened quietly. She didn't argue or question him. She just let him believe it. Everything was ready. The company was protected, the papers were filed, and her team knew what to do. Daniel was still walking straight into his own trap, blind to the truth. Charlotte stayed calm, patient, and silent. She had learned that the strongest moves are often made without noise, and hers was already in motion. The morning Daniel served the divorce papers, Charlotte was sitting at the kitchen table, reading her emails. He placed the envelope in front of her with a strange smile. "It's time we talk about what's fair," he said, his tone calm but cold. She looked at the papers, then at him, her face unreadable. Inside, her heart was steady. She had known this day would come, and she was ready for it. Daniel thought this was his moment of victory. He believed that within weeks, half of her company, her house, and her wealth would belong to him. He had planned it for months, certain she was too trusting to notice. What he didn't know was that everything he wanted had already slipped from his reach. The company he was trying to claim was no longer under her personal ownership. Every asset was legally safe inside the trust she had created weeks ago. A few days later, they both stood in court. Daniel arrived early, dressed sharply, full of confidence. He greeted his lawyer with a grin, whispering something that made them both laugh. Charlotte entered quietly with her attorney, Mark Ellison. She didn't say a word to Daniel, she just took her seat and waited for the session to begin. When the judge asked Daniel's lawyer to present his claim, he stood proudly, explaining how Daniel was entitled to half of Charlotte's business and assets. He talked for several minutes, listing figures and timelines. But when it was time to present evidence, everything started to crumble. Mark handed over the updated legal documents showing the trust's ownership and the company's separation from marital assets. The judge examined the papers carefully. Daniel's lawyer flipped through them, confused. The confidence on his face began to fade. "Your Honor," he started again, "we may need time to review these documents." But it was too late. The truth was clear, the business was legally protected and had been transferred well before the divorce filing. Daniel's expression changed from victory to disbelief. He turned toward Charlotte, his eyes wide with anger. "You planned this," he said under his breath. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. The judge's final words were calm and firm. Daniel had no claim to her company or its earnings. The divorce would proceed, but without any share of her business. Charlotte sat, still, hands folded, while Daniel looked down, his face pale. As the session ended, Charlotte stood up and walked out without looking back. Outside the courtroom, she took a deep breath. The fight was over. She hadn't shouted, she hadn't broken down, and she hadn't needed revenge. She had simply protected what was hers. For the first time in months, she felt free, quietly, powerfully, completely free. Daniel's voice filled the house that night, loud and desperate. He had just returned from meeting his lawyer and realized everything he planned was gone. He slammed the door, shouting her name. Charlotte stood in the living room, calm and silent. His face was red with anger, his eyes wild with disbelief. "You betrayed me," he yelled. "You took everything from me." Charlotte didn't move, she simply looked at him, her hands resting by her sides. "I protected what was mine," she said quietly. Her voice wasn't cold or cruel, it was steady, controlled. Daniel paced back and forth, trying to find the right words to hurt her. He accused her of being manipulative, of turning their marriage into a business deal. But his anger didn't shake her anymore. She had already cried her tears long ago. He tried to remind her of their early years together, the love, the struggles, the dreams. But his words sounded empty now. The man standing in front of her wasn't the man she had once loved. He was a stranger fueled by greed. When she stayed silent, he shouted louder, hoping to break her calm. But she refused to give him the reaction he wanted. For years, she had listened to his promises, his plans, his lies. Now, she was done listening. "You made your choice, Daniel," she said softly. "You wanted control. You wanted everything. Now you have nothing." Her words hit him harder than any argument could. He turned away, clenching his fists, realizing that no trick, no threat, could undo what she had already secured. He spent the next few days sending her messages, calling her, trying every tone he could: anger, guilt, sadness. He said she was cruel, then begged her to talk. She read every message but replied to none. The silence was her answer. For Charlotte, this wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about peace. At night, she sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, watching the quiet city lights. She thought about everything that had happened: the betrayal, the lies, the strength she never knew she had. It hurt, yes, but it also taught her how much she could endure without breaking. One morning, Daniel came to the house for the last time to collect his things. He didn't shout this time. He just looked tired. As he picked up his suitcase, he paused at the door. "You really don't feel anything anymore?" he asked. Charlotte met his eyes for a brief moment. "I feel free," she said. When he left, she closed the door gently behind him. There was no victory in her heart, only quiet relief. She had lost the man she once loved, but she had found herself again, stronger, wiser, and finally at peace. The courtroom was silent as everyone waited for the judge to return with the final decision. Charlotte sat straight, her hands folded tightly on her lap. Across the room, Daniel sat with his lawyer, whispering nervously. The confidence he had carried for months was gone. His plan had fallen apart, and he knew it. Charlotte didn't look at him, she focused on the papers in front of her, calm and steady. When the judge walked in, the sound of footsteps echoed through the room. He looked serious but not angry. Everyone stood, then sat again. The air felt heavy with tension. The judge began reading the findings, clear, direct, and undeniable. Every legal document confirmed that Charlotte's business was owned by her trust, created before the divorce filing. It was done lawfully, transparently, and with full records. There was no way Daniel could claim any share. Daniel's lawyer tried one last time to argue, saying the trust had been made in bad faith. But the judge stopped him. "Everything was done according to the law," he said firmly. "There is no evidence of wrongdoing." The courtroom grew even quieter. Daniel stared down at the table, his face pale. Charlotte's lawyer, Mark Ellison, thanked the court and handed over the last of the supporting documents. Charlotte stayed silent, not out of pride, but because she had nothing left to prove. She didn't need to defend herself anymore. The truth had already spoken for her. When the judge announced the final ruling, Daniel looked completely defeated. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes empty. The decision was final. Charlotte kept her company, her assets, and her freedom. Daniel would receive only what was fairly his, nothing more. It was justice, pure and simple. Charlotte stood slowly, gathered her things, and nodded respectfully to the judge before walking out. She didn't glance at Daniel. There was no reason to. Outside the courtroom, the air felt lighter. She took a deep breath, feeling something she hadn't felt in months: peace. Mark walked beside her and said softly, "It's over now." She gave a small smile, one that carried both exhaustion and strength. "Yes," she replied, finally. As she stepped outside, the sun was shining. Reporters were waiting nearby, but she didn't stop to speak. She wasn't interested in attention or headlines. She just wanted to go home, close the door, and start fresh. That evening, she sat on her balcony, watching the sunset. The city looked calm, alive, and full of possibility. For the first time, she could breathe freely without fear of what tomorrow might bring. The battle had been long, but she had won it with dignity. She didn't need revenge or applause, only peace. Charlotte smiled softly to herself. She had walked through betrayal, faced lies, and still came out standing tall. The court had given her justice, but more importantly, she had given herself closure. Months had passed since the court case ended, and Charlotte's life slowly began to find balance again. The house that once echoed with arguments was now filled with quiet. She had moved most of her things into a new apartment, smaller, calmer, and filled with sunlight. Every morning, she woke up early, made coffee, and sat by the window, enjoying the peace she had earned after so much pain. Her company was thriving again. Employees seemed happier, the environment warmer. Without Daniel's shadow hanging over her, she could finally focus on what she loved most, creating. She worked long hours, but this time, it didn't feel like pressure. It felt like freedom. Every decision she made reminded her that she was in control of her life again. One afternoon, she stood in her office, looking at the new product line on the shelf, Freedom by Hayes. The name carried her story without words. It wasn't about money or success anymore, it was about surviving, healing, and moving forward. Her team celebrated the launch quietly, with smiles and a sense of pride. For them, it was just another business milestone. For Charlotte, it was a personal victory. Sometimes she thought of Daniel, not with anger, but with acceptance. She didn't hate him anymore. Hatred would have kept her tied to the past, and she had no space left for that. He had made his choices, and she had made hers. She learned that peace didn't come from revenge, it came from letting go. On weekends, she started painting again, something she hadn't done since her early business days. Her paintings weren't perfect, but they made her feel alive. Each brushstroke felt like healing. It reminded her that life could be rebuilt piece by piece, no matter how badly it had been broken. One evening, she walked along the beach, her shoes in her hand, the wind brushing her face. The sky was turning orange and gold as the sun set over the water. She thought about everything she had gone through, the betrayal, the heartbreak, the fear, and how, through it all, she had found strength she never knew she had. There was no need for revenge or proving anyone wrong. The quiet was enough. The peace in her heart was enough. She realized that real victory wasn't about watching someone lose, it was about rebuilding yourself without bitterness. When she returned home that night, she placed a small note on her desk. It read, "You are free. Don't ever forget this." She smiled as she turned off the lights and looked around her new space. The pain that once filled her heart had finally faded, replaced by calm strength. Charlotte had lost a marriage but found herself again. She didn't just survive, she grew. And as she closed her eyes that night, she knew her story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about freedom.